As you can probably tell, I have the Sonos Era 300s, the 100s, and we're going to compare all of that to the HomePod 2 as well, all in pairs. So let's check it out. This stuff is really heavy. Let's talk about design and pricing first. As I go through the review, I'm going to compare the Era 100 and then the Era 300, both to the HomePod 2 and also by themselves as we go. When it comes to design, the Era 100, which comes in at $250, $50 less than a HomePod 2, it has one mid-size woofer and two tweeters. Sonos kind of made it difficult to find out the actual size of the woofers, and when it comes to bass, that really comes into the sound differentiation between HomePod and these Era speakers. The Era 100 itself is about the size of a HomePod 2. It's slightly taller, but they have pretty similar diameter, so if you're just trying to replace a HomePod, it'll definitely fit there. It is taller than the Sonos One and a little thinner. The Era 300, on the other hand, which is $450 a piece, $150 more than the HomePod 2, this thing is big. Too big probably for my desk even here in the studio, and it is very heavy, as you could probably tell when I was trying to hold all those speakers. The Era 300 actually has two woofers and four tweeters. It has a forward-firing mid-range tweeter, two side-firing, and one upwards. That's all for Dolby Atmos and spatial audio. And then it has two force-canceling woofers in the middle. Pretty much impossible to find the exact woofer size. Even in Sonos' video where it talks about creating these speakers, they don't actually show the woofer speakers in general. Now the speaker is definitely large, which you should take into account, but Sonos does make great mounting options, both freestanding, wall mount, and even ceiling mount for the Era 300. If you mount it on the ceiling, you're actually supposed to mount it upside down. So let's talk about sound. Now, so you know, every time I set up the Sonos speakers, or if I moved them from room to room, I did Sonos' TruePlay tuning. It's where you walk around the room, kind of wave your phone up and down. TruePlay tuning is supposed to tune the speakers to your room exactly. Now, the Era 100 speakers do not have spatial audio, by itself or in a stereo pair. You can put a stereo pair together, and that's what I compared to a pair of my HomePod 2s. A pair of Era 100s sound very good. And compared to my Sonos One SL, I've had a pair of those for over a year now, it is definitely improvement over the One SLs. They sound better. But comparing the Era 100 to a pair of HomePod 2s, I definitely prefer the HomePod 2 sound. It has a fuller sound, HomePod 2s are capable of spatial audio, and it does feel like a larger soundstage, and the bass response on the HomePod 2 is significantly better than the Era 100. Now when it comes to the Era 300, I'm going to be honest, I listened to a lot of music and watched movies on the pair of Era 300s, comparing it right in line with a pair of HomePod 2s, and it was difficult for me to really put my finger on the differences between these speakers. Now the Era 300 sounds incredible, don't get me wrong, and only a single Era 300 is capable of spatial audio thanks to that upward and side-firing tweeters. But the Era 300 has a very different tuning than the HomePod 2. And when listening to music, especially spatial audio or Dolby Atmos tracks on the Era 300, you could hear even the most minute and intricate detail. I do think the Era 300 in a pair does spatial audio better than a pair of HomePod 2s. Part of the reason is the Era 300 is set up to be a directional speaker. I know that sounds counterintuitive to spatial audio, but what I mean is the Era 300 is intended to put against a wall. The tweeters that fire upward to the side and forward is meant to be placed where nothing is really behind the speaker. HomePod 2, on the other hand, it has speakers all around. It's so you can place HomePod 2 in the middle of a room and it should sound good everywhere. But I feel like in most cases, having a speaker against the wall or on a home theater setup pointed into the room is how most people are going to use it. So when it comes to spatial audio or Dolby Atmos tracks, I do think the Era 300 does a better job of simulating that kind of virtual surround. One of the best tracks for testing this was The Greatest Show from The Greatest Showman. Putting the Era 300 side by side and playing that track, it sounded like Hugh Jackman's voice was coming from a center channel that was not physically in between these speakers. It was wild. And that's probably thanks to those side-firing tweeters. And I will say volume on the Era 300 is really loud. I mean, these things will be able to fill even the largest room you probably have. At first, I played the Era 300s and then my HomePod 2 pair, and I really had to raise the volume on the HomePods to make sure I can compare them accurately. Now, the one thing I had to keep testing to make sure I heard what I thought I heard, it feels like the bass is punchier on the HomePod 2, which sounds crazy because the Era 300 have two woofers, but maybe it's because of their positioning being sideways, and I was mainly testing them on a desk here in the studio. It felt like the HomePod 2 had a punchier bass. There was just more bass. Now, the nice thing about the Sonos app is you can increase the EQ of the bass for those speakers, and when I put it up to +3 and +4, I did start to feel the bass a little more like how I prefer. Unfortunately, with the HomePods, there's none of those EQ options like increasing the bass or treble. But just out of the box, it just felt like my HomePod 2 had a punchier bass than the Era 300. That's not to say the Era 300 doesn't have bass. It had plenty of bass, especially when you turn up the volume, and it was a very accurate, seemingly, representation of the bass. If it was a bass and hearing it pluck like in a jazz tune, like Snarky Puppy, you could really hear all those intricate details, and the bass did not overpower, again, which probably helps the overall clarity of the sound. But if you like a punchier bass, which that's kind of my preference, I play the bass, I kind of liked how the HomePod 2 represented it better. Also, I initially set up the pair of Era 300s in this studio, which is only a 9 by 8 foot room, kind of small. I actually found the pair of Era 300s sounded better in a larger room. Testing them here in this size room, they're literally overkill, but so much so that I think it actually hurts the sound of those large speakers in this kind of setup. Setting it up in a bedroom or living room, a larger room in general, I think the Era 300s perform way better in that environment. So as you decide what speakers you're buying, I think the size of room should definitely be considered. Here in this studio, if I was going to buy a pair of Sonos speakers and there was no HomePod option at all, I would probably get the Era 100s for this size room, but for my larger rooms, definitely the Era 300. Now when it comes to home theater setups, there's an interesting problem, especially with the Era 300s. You can set up the 100s and 300s as rear speakers in any current Sonos theater setup. I have a Sonos Beam in one room with a Sub Mini, and a Sonos Arc in another room with the Sub Gen 3. I love those home theater setups, and the virtual surround that those soundbars do is great. The Era 100s will probably do really well for most people. I set up the Era 300s as rear speakers in my Sonos Beam and Sub Mini setup. They are the best rear speakers I've ever heard, and that's probably because they're both capable of spatial audio by themselves. Those Era speakers are shooting sound sideways and upward and forward, so as rear speakers, those Era 300s are incredible. Might be overkill for most home theater setups, but the Era 100s would definitely be ideal rear speakers. Now when it comes to using a pair of Sonos Era 300s with maybe your Apple TV, you run into a bit of a problem. They are AirPlay 2 compatible, like the 100s are as well, but the Apple TV acts weird when it comes to Dolby Atmos soundtracks for movies and airplaying that to a speaker. If you ever want to know if your Apple TV is using the Dolby Atmos audio track for the content you're watching, press the up arrow or swipe up on the Apple TV remote and you'll see the little sound waveform. There you can choose from different audio tracks, sometimes different languages, but you'll see a Dolby Atmos tag in that little window so you'll know you're listening to Dolby Atmos. Setting up a pair of HomePod 2s with an Apple TV using Apple's stock method, it will always play Dolby Atmos when it's supposed to. But if you choose to AirPlay to speakers using the control center on an Apple TV, it actually doesn't play Dolby Atmos, even when I'm sending it to the Sonos Era 300 speakers, probably because the Apple TV doesn't know that those speakers are capable of it. But strangely, when I went to the Apple TV settings and set up a temporary audio output device, put that to the Sonos Era 300s, then all of a sudden it would play the Dolby Atmos track through the Era 300s. I'm not sure if that's how it's supposed to work, but it sounded really good playing content from the movie. If you were looking just to use two speakers with your Apple TV specifically, a pair of HomePod 2s is actually going to allow you to permanently connect those to the Apple TV and will probably be a better user experience. The Era 300s will have to be constantly connected back to the Apple TV in the settings menu, and it's just not ideal for an Apple TV and two-speaker setup. But again, as rear speakers, the Era 300s are wild. Really, they do sound amazing. And probably the best audio experience I had listening to music while testing all these speakers is setting up those Era 300s with my Arc and Sub Gen 3. That was an amazing sound experience. Having the Era 300s behind me, the Sonos Arc in front of me, and the Sub Gen 3 off to the side, that sounded amazing. But you're also talking almost $3,000 worth of speakers with a pair of Era 300s at $900, a Sonos Arc at around $900, and then the Sonos Sub Gen 3 at $750. Keep in mind, there's no way to hook up the Era 300s via HDMI or optical audio directly to a TV or home theater system. Now, when it comes to some of the other features for the Era 100 and 300, they both can actually use Bluetooth to connect to devices, and they have AirPlay 2. So if you want to connect them as Bluetooth speakers or use them in AirPlay 2 with all the other AirPlay 2 speakers in your house, you can do that. And what's nice is they both have the option to use a line-in connection. This is a nice use case for something like a Mac. Here in the studio, I would have liked to use my HomePod 2s as the default speakers for my Mac. But because you always have to AirPlay audio to those speakers, it just doesn't work. And if I edit video in Final Cut, there's too much of a delay and Final Cut gets weird when it's AirPlaying audio to speakers. So using the Sonos with a line-in connection is pretty ideal, especially with a computer. Unfortunately, that line-in connection, which is just USB-C, doesn't work with an inexpensive USB-C to headphone adapter. I had one, I tried it. The Sonos speakers don't recognize it's connected. If you want to use them with that line-in connection or via Ethernet, you have to buy Sonos's $20 USB-C to headphone adapter. The Era speakers have the Amazon Voice Assistant and Sonos's own voice assistant, and I've used the Sonos Voice Assistant on my Arc and Beam. It does pretty well. It's good for playing music on your Sonos systems if you don't want to grab your devices, but it doesn't do a lot else, especially as much as Siri. There is a hard mute switch, so if you don't want the microphone ever listening or a voice assistant to ever listen to you, you can flip that hardware switch on the back of the speaker and know that the microphone is shut off. But the Sonos Era speakers don't really have any smart home features built in. HomePod 2 has Thread, which is great for smart home. They can act as HomeKit hubs for your Apple Home. It does have an easier integration with the Apple TV Home Theater. Plus it has all the Siri benefits. Some of you might not think Siri is a benefit, but I think Siri is a benefit, especially with the new HomePod 2. Very fast to respond. You can run shortcut commands right on the HomePods. So there are a lot more smart home and additional features that the HomePod 2 has over these Era speakers, especially if you're in the Apple ecosystem, which is a key factor. HomePod 2 also has temperature and humidity sensors. For what that's worth, Era speakers do not. So which of these speakers should you buy? That's a really tough decision. If you're looking for a pair of speakers, maybe for your office or a small studio, if you're totally in the Apple ecosystem, I think the HomePod 2, a pair of those, is still one of your best options. It's $600 for a pair, they sound incredible, plus they have all the Apple features that you might be accustomed to in the ecosystem. If you want something that sounds very similar, but you don't care about the Apple ecosystem, or maybe a line-in is very important to you, a pair of Sonos 100s in a smaller room will do really well. Might not have the bass response you're looking for, but they sound good, and if you want to add those to a home theater setup where you already have a Beam or Arc, they act great as rear speakers. But what about the Sonos Era 300? If you get a pair of Era 300s, you're talking $900. A pair of HomePod 2s, $600. Strangely, I think one of the biggest factors to deciding between these two speaker options, one again is your ecosystem. How deep are you into Apple HomeKit? How much do you use Siri? Do you use shortcuts triggered on your HomePod? Do you already have a bunch of HomePods and want them all to match? And also size. For the size, HomePod 2 sounds incredible. The Era 300 is clearly a very large speaker, very heavy. It feels like it should sound really good. HomePod 2 is deceivingly small and still provides a great sound. So the space you have to put these speakers is another factor. Finally, I think your ability to distinguish spatial audio, if you feel that that's really a benefit to your listening experience, or if that's actually what you listen to. Check to see if a lot of the music you listen to or movies you watch even have Dolby Atmos or spatial audio capability. I think that's the biggest differentiator between the Era 300s and the HomePod 2s. On the other hand, if you're all in on the Sonos ecosystem, maybe you already have some Sonos 1SLs, the Arcs, and the Beams, and the Era 300 is going to fit right in. And I will say the Sonos app does a really good job of letting you control all those speakers in different rooms in a seamless way, really well designed, plus you can adjust the EQ on those speakers. Finally, I think you should also consider bass response. You can pair a Sonos Sub Mini with those Era 300s, and that would sound really incredible. But if you want that thumpy bass, for some reason I just feel like I prefer the bass on my HomePod 2s than the Era 300s. And again, for their size, and especially here in this room, my studio, which is fairly small, the HomePod 2s just fit that niche really well. Final thing I'll say, when you do listen to them side by side, the Era 300 and the HomePod 2s, it's clear that the Era 300 has a wider soundstage or provides a wider presence, again, because of all those speakers firing in the different directions. And if you have them against a wall, the Era 300 is going to perform better. But I also really think you should experience these in person, maybe at a Best Buy, and see what they sound like to you specifically. As far as I'm concerned, I'm still really happy with my pair of HomePod 2s here in my studio. I don't feel a reason to upgrade those to an Era 300, and my Sonos 1SLs, which I actually use outside on a patio, I don't really feel a need to update those to the Era 100s either. But if you have a total blank slate and you're looking for maybe a single speaker that does spatial audio and sounds great, the Sonos Era 300, just getting one of those will probably do you really well, and it's cheaper than a pair of HomePod 2s, which again, I've been testing pairs this entire video. But if you're just going to get one single speaker, I do think the Era 300 will outperform a HomePod 2 one-on-one. Hopefully I covered everything, but if you have more questions, let me know in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe to the Bearded Teacher channel. You can check out my HomePod 2 review comparing it to the Sonos Arc and Beam above, or that link is in the description. And there's lots of great smart home content both on the channel and more coming soon. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you in the next video.